Victoria Potts to give us that overview. Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Again, my name is Victoria Potts with Legislative Research. I will be presenting from the white document in front of you. This says Kansas Department of Labor. And the first page I'll draw your attention to is page 3. On page 3, looking at that state general fund graph at the bottom of the page, you'll notice an increase in fiscal year 2022 state general fund expenditures. That's firstly due to the legislature appropriating $9.6 million for the Ui Modernization Project. The green line, which indicates the agency's request, also has an increase due to the staffing supplemental that we'll talk about later, but the agency has requested state general fund monies to increase staffing in the administration and UI programs. That decrease in 2023 is because the $9.6 million for the Ui Modernization Project is no longer there, but the agency is still requesting an enhancement for staffing in the UI and administration programs. And again, we'll talk about those enhancements and supplementals later on. We'll turn the page to page 4. On page 4, looking underneath the box at the agency estimate, the agency estimates revised 2022 expenditures of $298.4 million, including $17.7 million SGF. This is an all funds decrease of $164 million and a state general fund increase of $6.8 million above the fiscal year 2022 approved amount. I'll start with that all funds decrease. It's primarily due to first item number 2, anticipated decreased expenditures on unemployment insurance benefits. So that's the amount that's actually going out to individuals, is expected to decrease by about $214 million for fiscal year 2022. I would also note item number 3, the agency received $11 million from the State Finance Council from federal COVID-19 relief funds to continue to support surge staffing in the call center for fiscal year 2022. Item number 4, federal UI administration. So the agency receives federal funds to administer the unemployment insurance program. That amount is expected to increase by about $30 million above what the agency originally estimated for fiscal year 2022. I'll turn the page to page 5. On page 5, I'll talk about that state general fund increase, and that's for item number 6, staffing supplementals. The agency is requesting $6.8 million state general fund and 110 FTE positions in fiscal year 2022 for additional staffing in the administration and unemployment insurance services program. I'll move on to the governor's recommendation, still on page 5. The governor recommends 2022 expenditures of $291.8 million, including $11 million state general fund. This is a decrease of $6.6 million, all state general fund below the agency's revised estimate. That decrease is due to the governor not recommending the $6.8 million state general fund and 110 FTE positions for additional staffing in the administration and UI services programs. However, the governor did recommend $135,000 state general fund to provide salary enhancements for customer service representatives and adjudicators in the UI program. And finally, the governor also recommended $100,000 to implement 2021 Special Session House Bill 2001, which requires the agency to investigate complaints filed under the provisions of the bill. And Mr. Chairman, I can stand for questions on fiscal year 2022 or move on to 2023.
Committee questions for 22? Senator Hawk.
I just have one on that page 5, number 9, in terms of the governor not recommending that enhancement for the 110 FTE positions. I'm assuming that's because our claims are down. Is there a reason for that you know of, or I'll throw that out there so the agency knows to respond to that when they present?
Sure, I'll give a short response and then the agency can expand on that. I will preview that the agency is receiving some money in fiscal year 2023 for supplemental staffing, but just not for fiscal year 2022. After they submitted their request, the agency worked with the governor. And recognizing that workloads were somewhat returning more to normal levels, they decided not to request the 2022 that they had originally had, and the governor did not recommend it.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Rowley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this may be for the agency when they get up here, but the staffing level today, is it up to maximum, what has been allowed, or do we have vacancies?
I'll let them answer that, if that's okay.
Thank you.
Other questions? Let's go on to 23.
Great. Fiscal year 2023 is on page 7. On page 7, looking at the agency's request, the agency requests 2023 expenditures of $225.9 million, including $8.5 million state general fund. This is an all funds decrease of $76.6 million and an SGF decrease of $9.3 million below the agency's fiscal year 2022 revised estimate. I'll start with that all funds decrease. Again, item number 1, the agency is estimating decreased expenditures for unemployment insurance benefits in fiscal year 2023. Item number 2 is also contributing to that decrease. So I mentioned the $11 million that the State Finance Council approved from federal COVID relief funds in 22 for surge staffing support. Those funds are not available in 2023. So that is contributing to the overall decrease. And item number 3, the agency is also estimating decreased federal funds for the Unemployment Insurance Administration. And I'll turn the page to page 8. Page 8, item number 6, staffing enhancements. So the agency is requesting a total of $7.2 million for additional staffing in the administration and UI services programs. And I'll move on to the governor's recommendation, still on page 8. The governor recommends $217.3 million, including $3.9 million state general fund. This is a decrease of $4.6 million below the agency's 2023 request. For those staffing enhancements, the agency requested $7.2 million, but the governor has recommended $2.2 million state general fund and 30 FTE positions for additional staffing in those programs. The governor's also recommended about $408,000 state general fund to provide salary enhancements to customer service representatives and adjudicators in the UI program. And something else I would like to point out, since this document was created and since the agency's request was submitted, under Senate Bill 159, the $9.6 million that was appropriated from the state general fund for the Modernization Project, Senate Bill 159 also included language that the agency should seek federal funds instead of state general fund. Since that time, federal funds have been found from the American Rescue Plan Act. So that $9.6 million SGF has been lapsed, and the agency will instead use federal funds for that project. So that has happened just last week, so it's not reflected in this document, but I wanted to share that with you.
You'll provide a supplemental note when we present this to the...
Yes, yeah, you can make a note, and I'll put that in the subcommittee report. And Mr. Chairman, if anyone was looking for details on those supplemental and enhancement requests, you can look at page 9. It provides details on that staffing request that I had been talking about earlier. And Mr. Chairman, I will stand for questions. After I point out one more thing, I'm sorry. During Joint Building Committee, Senator Clays asked for information on what the estimated costs of the agency's capital improvements were versus what they actually spent. And so that's that extra sheet of paper in front of you, providing what the estimated cost was versus the actual cost. And now, Mr. Chairman, I'll stand for questions on the Department of Labor's budget.
Okay, thank you for that. Questions? Senator Clays?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for providing that to the agency and to staff. It looks like those were really close to the numbers, so I appreciate it. On the totals, however, it looks like we were quite a bit off on the individual items. So, I guess 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, but I would like to see maybe some more effort put into the estimation process on these when we go to joint state building construction. And this is not specific to the Department of Labor. I want to make that clear too. I just picked them out of the bunch because I assumed that we'd probably come up with something like this where they were off. But a lot of agencies do that, where they're just picking the round number and then we go through and approve it, and it tends to come in under actual, which I guess is a good thing. Anyway, thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Senator Hawk?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this question may be for you and the agency. I'm not sure where we are in terms of acquiring the computer equipment that we need in terms of the modernization and where that is in the budget. And then my other question is, I know we put $250 million in to replenish the trust fund with a possibility of another 250, and I'm not sure where that is. So just looking for the status of those two fairly major things.
Sure, so I'll go backwards. Your first question or your second question for the $250 million that was transferred from American Rescue Plan dollars into the UI Trust Fund, that transfer took place in July. And additional information on the UI Trust Fund can be found on page 10. And for your first question on the computer system, I'll let the agency expand, but I do know that a vendor has been chosen for the project, but the negotiations are still ongoing for the finalization of that contract, so the project hasn't started yet, but I'll let the agency expand more on that.
And then just to give them a heads up, I'll want to know when we think that might likely be completed or what the estimates are on that. So thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Committee, any other questions? Okay, thank you. Next, we'll have the agency come forward. Who's first? Who's up? Identify yourself, please. Good morning. Welcome to committee.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Peter Brady. I'm the Deputy Secretary at the Kansas Department of Labor. Here with me today, I also have Secretary Schultz, our Chief Financial Officer, Don Palmberg, and Julie McGinney, our Government Affairs Director, as well as a few others. And I'm happy I can jump into the questions that were asked that were going to be directed to the agency if you'd like me to, Mr. Chairman.
Anybody want to restate their questions, or we'll let him give us some answers and then go from there? Hey, we all agree to that, so go ahead.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The first question I remember off the top of my head, Senator Alley, you'd asked about vacancies at the agency in our current state. Our staffing level today is higher than our pre-pandemic level in terms of roles filled at the agency. We don't have every single role filled. What I'm sure I hear from a lot of employers, I'm sure you hear from employers in your districts, is that it is a pretty competitive labor market right now. So we're doing everything we can to compete for talent, to get folks in to work in the unemployment program and other support areas. But at this point in time, not every single position is filled. Senator Hawk, to your question regarding the Modernization Project, we had a bit of a unique procurement process. Some of you might recall House Bill 2196 that passed towards the end of the last session was a very significant unemployment legislation. It was about 100 pages long. One of the provisions in that bill was the creation of the Unemployment Insurance Modernization Council. That council has a few of your colleagues in the Senate, members of the House, myself, representatives from the employer and the employee community. They had some input on the modernization project as the RFP was going through. Vendors submitted presentations to that council as well. What that bill also did was created a slightly different procurement negotiating committee than exists in statute. So for most projects at the state that go through the D of A procurement process, once they cross that dollar threshold, there's a 3-person procurement negotiating committee that usually has 2 members of the agency and someone from D of A. 2196 slightly modified in that the PNC for this specific project included 1 representative from the agency, 1 representative from the Department of Administration, and the chairman of the Joint Committee on Information Technology, which is Representative Kyle Hoffman. So those 3 individuals make up the PNC. As we went through the procurement process, we saw the bids, all the information from the vendors and demos. members of the agency who are subject matter experts in their various areas of unemployment and the support functions signed NDAs so they could participate in that and then provide their feedback. All of that feedback was then brought together to the procurement negotiating committee, and then those three individuals looking at that, the pricing and all the other factors, make the determination on who is selected for the project. At this point in time, the PNC has said they've selected a vendor out of the bidders. They're currently in contract negotiations and expect to finalize that contract negotiation within the next few weeks, certainly not months. At that point in time, once a contract is finalized and signed, can be publicly announced and the project can kick off.
Senator Hawk, continue.
Just what would be best case estimate when we would have this completed and have the whole system modernized so we're prepared for what might be the next disaster that we can't anticipate?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. So I'll start by saying, prior to the pandemic, when you looked at unemployment insurance modernization projects, you were generally looking at a 3 to 5 year time frame, with 3 years being the absolute quickest anybody had ever done one. No one's ever come in under 3 years to this point in time. Generally speaking, you're looking closer to 4 or 5. And when I say full modernization too, I mean a benefit system and a tax system that work together. That being said, with the onslaught of the pandemic, many states are looking to either modernize, or states that modernized 10, 15 years ago to re-modernize. There's a lot of optimism in the unemployment community and the vendor community that you can cut that time to closer to 2 years for a full system modernization. I'd say at this point, we're optimistic we're going to be closer to the 2 to 3 year time frame, but I'd caveat that by saying, as of today, no one has done it in under 3 years.
What's the life expectancy of something like that? I mean, we've got other departments that are turning over IT equipment in 60 months. So what's the life expectancy of the new system?
Yeah, Senator, so I'd say that, the hope is that you build the system correctly and then you make the investment to maintain the system, and it holds through decades. While our current system, legacy system that I'm sure you all have heard us talk about, has a lot of challenges, up until the point of the pandemic, the mainframe, which was stood up in the late 70s, has been somewhat reliable in terms of processing unemployment claims until the pandemic hit. So the goal here is to have a system that, one, we do it right the first time, and then two, we make the investments to keep that system maintained. An example I'd point to, Senator, is our neighbors to the east in Missouri. They modernized about 8 years ago now. They certainly had problems. Every state did, just in terms of volume of claims. But they were able to address those problems quicker and get through backlogs quicker because their system was a much more solid foundation.
So on the federal level, when we interact with them, with the system, as I assume we do, what kind of activity or problems do we have with the feds?
So, Mr. Chairman, I'll say that part of the American Rescue Plan Act that passed in March of 2021 included $2 billion allocation to the U.S. Department of Labor to assist states in modernizing their unemployment systems. I would say that if you were to ask myself or any of the 30 other states that still have a mainframe component to their system, the number one way you modernize the system, you get people paid more efficiently, and you don't have the problems next time around that we saw in the pandemic, is to just get states off the mainframe. There's no other way to do it. You can do ancillary projects, you can have other little bolt-ons, as they call them, to the system that help out. But as long as the mainframe is still the core processing component, you're going to have problems. Mr. Chairman, what I'd add is that, since that happened almost a year ago to today, U.S. Department of Labor has not substantially allocated those funds to states to modernize. There have been a few little projects. There was something that was called Tiger Teams, which was, little SWAT teams that went out to states to help them identify problems and fix them. There were some other grant opportunities that the state's pursuing to, fix components of the system or address backlogs, which is great. And then the U.S. Department of Labor stood up the Office of Ui Modernization within the Office of the Secretary. They've appointed a few officials to staff that office. But I think the frustration from myself and other UI administrators across the country is there hasn't been any information or guidance on, here's how we want to use this $2 billion that Congress allocated to help you take the mainframe, get all that information to a modern system, and retire it. Because in my view, Mr. Chairman, that's priority 1A.
There's a lot of fraudulent claims out there, and persons were hit with those innocently. Where are we at in the resolution of any of that?
Yeah, and I'll thank you, Mr. Chairman. So one piece I'll talk about kind of quickly too. I talked about House Bill 2196 and the Modernization Council. One of the charges of the council in that legislation was to procure and ensure is conducted an audit of the fraud that may have occurred in the system. We had an audit with the LPA. While the agency disagreed with some of the findings or some of the methodology, LPA did a good job at getting to the kind of starting point for looking at this problem. But it's outside the scope of the LPA in that you really need a forensic audit to look at all of the claims, look at all of the information, and determine just how substantial the fraud issue was. And Senator Hawk had mentioned the $250 million that went into the trust fund in July. The results of this audit will determine if any more money from the American Rescue Plan Act is going to go into the trust fund, depending on what the findings of that audit are. I can tell you that the Modernization Council has contracted with BKD, who's an accounting firm that offers some consulting services to perform this audit. That audit has kicked off and is underway, and they will be presenting their preliminary report to the Modernization Council, I believe, by May 1st, and then a final report by September 1st of this year. So I'd say, Mr. Chairman, that audit is going to give us the best answer that we can in terms of the scope of that problem. What I can say, too, is that the systems we put in place about this time last year, mainly multi-factor authentication and ID verification, had a huge impact in stopping the number of initial claims that were hitting the system, stopping a lot of the fraudsters, the bot attacks that we were seeing. And the level of fraud that was hitting the state is just nowhere, not even comparable to what it was this time last year.
Discussing the fund balance, with the robust economy we've got, increasing employment, decreasing unemployment, higher wages, unemployment tax is rising. Give us some sort of a estimate looking forward in the next 6 months on what kind of percentage increase we can see in the fund or stabilization or something of that nature.
Yeah, absolutely, Mr. Chairman. And I keep referring to House Bill 2196, but there was a lot of great work by the legislature to address some of these issues last year, and we're starting to see that come to fruition. One of the provisions of 2196 was to freeze the tax rate for the next 2 years for employers. The thinking behind that was that there was a significant fraud issue. We knew that there was an influx of funds going to the trust fund from the American Rescue Plan Act, so that employers would, to simplify it, be held harmless for any changes in the rates. So for an employer, the rate schedule was frozen for the next 2 years. I gave a presentation to House Appropriations on the health of the trust fund. The way the U.S. Department of Labor has us measure the health of the trust fund is a metric called the average high cost multiple. What the average high cost multiple is measuring is basically if you take the 3 worst years in terms of impacts to the trust fund, and you took the average of how much we paid out in a year, and then looked at the trust fund today, could we pay our worst year out for a year? So if your average high cost multiple is 1, that means you have enough money to pay your worst year for 12 months. Our average high cost multiple is 0.98, so we're almost at 1, not quite. What we'll see here in the next 2 months is at the end of the first quarter is when first quarter contributions are due from employers. Because of the way unemployment insurance taxes are structured, the vast majority of contributions come in that first quarter because you're only taxed on the first $7,000 of payroll for an employee. So generally, we see a bump somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 to 250 million in contributions between the end of March and the end of April. That kind of end of first quarter, they have 30 days to pay it. So I would anticipate after first quarter contributions will be well above that 1.0 average high cost multiple. And the other factor of that too is the unemployment rate in the states, I think 3.3% in our last report. Assuming that continues and contributions come as expected, there's no concerns about solvency of our trust fund. And Mr. Chairman, just as a point of context, I'd add that because of work done by the legislature in 2015, we entered the pandemic in a much better state than many states were in. There were 5 states that were still paying off loans from the Great Recession coming into the pandemic. And there are now states that have balances north of $10 million that they owe the U.S. Department of Labor between loans from the Great Recession and loans they took out during the pandemic.
Could you give us an idea of what your agreed dollar amount is due to fraud?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, so the The second part of the LPA audit that came out in August of 2021 identified two potential universes of fraud. They said if you took the total number of absolute possible fraud, you were somewhere just shy of 700 million. And breaking that down into two components, there was about 380 million that was high confidence. In other words, many of the data fields, flags that were looked at would say that this is likely fraud that paid out. There was another, the balance off that 380 million, 300 some million, I think 317 million, that was low confidence. It was, this is possibly fraud, but it doesn't have nearly enough data elements for us to say that we very strongly believe it is. The agency's position has been, and this is part of our LPA response if any members are interested to see, is that the 380 million is likely pretty close or in the general ballpark, plus or minus 10%. We agree that the other universe is low confidence and that a good chunk of that is not fraud. So, Mr. Chairman, I'd say that, I think that 380 million is in the general ballpark. But what I'd add to that, too, is the audit that the Modernization Council and Legislature put into statute last year is really what gets us there, because that's all estimates. And until we get the forensic audit, that's how we get a final answer.
Do we have any idea what the federal government is doing in pursuit of any of that fraud?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, so the U.S. Department of Labor's Office of Inspector General is generally who take charge at USDOL. They have worked with every state in terms of looking at our data. We provide them information, they provide analysis. In addition to the Office of Inspector General, I know that the Secret Service is working very closely on this issue at the federal level, as well as the FBI. And we have agreements with all those agencies. We've worked with those agencies to provide them information. It's been in the news some, and I suspect it's going to come out a lot more, that both the Secret Service and the FBI have begun to find domestic criminal syndicates where they find they've been committing unemployment fraud in anywhere from 5 to 30 states. But those are the agencies at the federal level that we're working with.
Okay. I have two other questions, one involving FTEs and the other one involving claims processing. If you want to take both of those, where are we at in claims processing? Is two parts. Are we backlogged yet because with pandemic type problems? And how are we resolving those, if any, if there's any out there? And then new claims coming forward, how quickly and how efficiently are we handling that process?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'll take the second part first, then kind of get back into the backlogs. So someone applying for unemployment insurance today, the initial claim process and determination is what USDOL will consider timely. The timeliness standard from the U.S. Department of Labor is 21 days on adjudicatable issues. Just to provide kind of a quick example for those that aren't as familiar with the unemployment system, if there is a dispute between you and your employer on the nature of your separation, for example, they say they fired you, you say you quit, and we have to adjudicate that issue. The timeliness standard on that is 21 days. Claims that are being submitted today are being adjudicated in a timely manner. So that's kind of where that is today. Now, to get back to backlogs, there's two areas where the agency still sees backlogs. One is unemployment insurance appeals. So an individual filed for unemployment, their claim was denied for an eligibility or entitlement purpose. They disagree with the agency's determination and filed an appeal, which is an independent judicial review of that claim, to go through that process. That is backlogged. As of today, when you file an appeal, it will get processed and docketed in about 4 months, and then a month after that, there will be a hearing, and then a decision will be sent to the claimant. That is, kind of if you look at the flow of things, right, from the pandemic era programs, everybody's received their initial determination of eligibility or ineligibility. And then those that have appealed are the ones that are working through that judicial process. It is somewhat comparable to, like a U.S. court system. If someone goes further to higher and higher appellate levels, those take more time in terms of docketing it, getting the information, getting the packets together, and all the parties for a hearing. The other area where a backlog still exists is fraud investigations. And I'll have to be very specific here because I think a challenge that at least I have had representing the agency over the last year is when we say fraud, everybody thinks of what I would call imposter fraud, which is someone stole my identity, Peter Brady, and filed a claim in New Jersey under my name and in an attempt to get benefits. That's the fraud we talk about really when we talk about the fraud that paid out we were talking about, Mr. Chairman. But there's also a lot of other types of fraud, and they have become much more pronounced during the pandemic. specifically wage fraud. So that's an example of where, let's say I was claiming unemployment insurance benefits and I went back to work and I continued to claim benefits while also working. Well, the agency gets quarterly wage reports from all the employers in the state. So at a certain point, you might get away with it for a little while, but as we get those wage reports in, we can very clearly see when someone was claiming UI, but also working and receiving wages. There's also a lot of cases, and this is particular to the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program, of fraudulent documentation. So individuals that submit falsified documents in an attempt to entitle themselves to benefits that they're not entitled to under the law. Those investigations are very timely because usually they involve us conducting an interview of the individual, conducting fact-finding, talking to the employer, for example, so we make sure we understand their wage report and what happened. That is another area where there's still a population of claimants that are being investigated and going through that process. I hope that addressed the question, Mr. Chairman.
Nope, good answers, if they're all correct. Staffing, what contractual staffing remains, and for how long? Can you give us any idea, terms and conditions?
Yes, absolutely, Mr. Chairman. And I'll kind of briefly go back to our history with staffing of the pandemic, just because I think that context will be informative. Up until July of 2020, the agency really didn't have any temporary contractual staff. At a certain point, there was many changes in the leadership structure of the agency. And when a new secretary came in, we started to contract for temporary staff. We used both a local firm here in Topeka as well as Accenture to meet some of those staffing needs. That number throughout the late summer and fall of 2020 kind of fluctuated in or around probably 100 total temporary staff that were assisting with various areas of the program. As we got into the spring, there were a few significant things that happened. One, the programs all lapsed as of December 26th, but then Congress and then the president signed a bill extending them after they'd already lapsed in late December, extending them to March, and then the Rescue Plan Act extended them again. All of these programs being extended put our system into a bit of a tailspin because we then had to restand up all of these programs, all of these individuals that were on benefits that then lapsed had to get back onto benefits, and it created enormous challenges for the agency. But in addition to that, there was a huge staffing demand because call volumes hit levels we hadn't seen even at the earliest stages of the pandemic. At that point in time, we ramped up the call center staffing substantially, reaching a high of somewhere around 550, 600 total contractual staff, kind of in that late spring, early summer. As we got through the summer, as the unemployment rate went down, as federal programs were about to end, we just saw workloads go down pretty substantially, and then we started to remove those contracted staff kind of behind that as the workload got more manageable. Where we are today, there's probably about 100 total individuals across the agency that are contracted or temporary staff. There's some that are still supporting our call center. There are many in the IT space that are IT roles that we're hoping and have posted to fill as full-time employees, but we're keeping the contractor there until we have someone to fill that role and can transition it.
So going back to full-time FTEs, any of the other committee may have questions on, there's a little disparity in what you're requesting and what the governor approved. You want to address that at all?
Yeah, absolutely, Mr. Chairman. And when we started with our request too, the mindset was, what is everything we'd absolutely need to solve problems as quickly as possible and to get contracted resources off the agency balance sheet as quickly as possible. And working with the governor's office, and then since the time of that, initial request, the changes in our workloads, we've determined that what the governor's recommendation landed on makes sense for the agency while being much less costly to the budget. But that was kind of the place we started at, and obviously things have changed substantially. Particularly, as I mentioned before, the unemployment rate's much lower, the initial claims volume's much lower. We feel that where the governor's recommendation landed today is probably right at what we need to quickly transition off the temporary and contracted staff to full-time employees and continue to address some of the backlogs I mentioned earlier, Mr. Chairman.
Any other questions, committee? Senator Alley?
Thank you. Thank you. So if I heard what you said, your numbers look like to me that FTE in 23 is 595, and you'd requested more than that. Is that correct?
I think Victoria's can provide a clarification there.
Well, what my question was, so if I heard you right, you were going to transition the contract labor off, and are you planning on bringing new hires in for that? That was your plan when you submitted your number. The governor then said no on the 100 staff, the new ones.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator, I can clarify a little bit there. The end goal is to get all of the contracted and temporary staff no longer working with the agency, and then the roles that we need to fill as full-time agency employees. That is not a one-to-one ratio because as we're going through the process of doing this, workloads are going down substantially, right? One of the things we were looking at when we initially submitted the request was there were other areas that were backlogged then that we wanted to get through quickly, and more staff would have helped to do that, but since that time and today, we've gotten through those, and those are no longer an urgent need. We're timely in those areas. Because that's, I think, the two things that the agency wants to get at is, one, anything we need to filling through a full-time agency employee and not having contracted temporary staff, and then two, ensuring that we have the resources we need to meet those timeliness metrics from USDOL. But I guess to address your question, Senator, it's not necessarily a one-to-one, because as the grounds change, we may need less resources to do so.
And if I may, second part of that, going back to the mainframe and what you got, what I heard anyway, was that you were going to put, I'll say, patches on the mainframe that we have today until the new mainframe comes in. Is that to get you by? Is that correct?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. So, the plan is to get the mainframe. I guess I'll back up and say we had to do a lot of work across the pandemic to stabilize the mainframe. The mainframe that we have today compared to the one we had 2 years ago entering the pandemic is a much more stable system, and we've fixed a lot of the issues. The reason those issues hadn't come up is because, prior to the pandemic, we administered one unemployment program that paid 16 to 26 weeks of benefits depending on the UI rate in the state. Over the course of the pandemic, we had to administer 7 different unemployment programs that did a maximum of 79 weeks across them. And the system, just a change of that magnitude, suffered. There were challenges. Where we are today is assuming the federal government does not ask us to implement any new programs, doesn't ask us to go beyond the 26-week maximum that's in the state today. We believe the system today is stable enough to do so until the modernized system's deployed.
Okay, and I'm going to use the word patches that you put on the mainframe. Those costs will be, you can't carry those forward. You can't use those patches when the new equipment comes. Is that correct? You don't need them, that's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I mean, that's any work that's done on the mainframe, once it's retired, we won't see any further benefit on it. I'd probably say, too, at this point in time, most of the patches or work we needed to do to the mainframe is accounted for in the work the agency's done over the past 2 years. We don't anticipate having to do many more patches between now and the deployment of the modernized system.
Thank you.
Senator Hawk.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple questions, a couple comments. So the new modernized system is probably not going to have a mainframe. You're probably going to have a data services, or as we heard from Secretary Burns-Wallace yesterday, or some kind of cloud computing system. Is that correct?
Yeah, Senator, that's correct. I can assure you, as long as I'm in my current role, there will not be a mainframe component to the modernized system. There's a few different solutions out there. Many states utilize a cloud base for their processing. Some use kind of other base methods, but it will be something of that nature.
So I shouldn't go back and find my COBOL textbook from college 50 years ago and see if I could learn that programming eventually.
Please do. I'll connect you with our CIO. I'm sure we could use the help.
Actually, I never took that course because that looked too hard. I guess one concern I have, and I appreciate the question that our chair asked about the claims processing, but it looks to me like we're just in a legal process in terms of adjudicating those claims, and that process is going to have to play out. But we don't have near the number of people that we had having difficulties accessing the system, and certainly all the fraud complicated that. So are we kind of looking at resolving that, saying for those people who are in those backlogs, say in the next 6 months likely?
Yeah, Senator, I'll speak to that briefly. I guess I'll say that while, yes, today we are much better situation for Kansans than we were at this time a year ago. The job is not done and there's still work to do. As I mentioned, there's still some areas that have backlogs. Part of the governor's recommendation that we landed on, some of those FTEs coming in are 10 appeals referees. I mentioned that the judicial process, you talked about the appellate process, is today what's probably holding up most claimants. So trying to get in just additional referees who can go in and work through that case log and, not all these people will be found to be eligible for benefits, but they will receive a final determination decision of the agency with further appellate rights if they choose to pursue it. In terms of time frame, I think 6 months is absolutely what we're targeting in terms of getting everything back to timely. I mentioned too the timeliness standard for initial claims and adjudications of 21 days. On the appellate side, what's considered timely is a much longer time frame because, again, it's a judicial process. It just takes more time. USDOL standard on that regard is 80% of appeals filed should be resolved within 45 days. There's no metric they use to measure us on 100%. I'd probably extend that out to say by 60 days, our goal would be having all appeals or the vast majority resolved. We're not there today. We're hoping that the supplemental request in the budget that we agreed with on the governor and those additional referees is what gets us to that point.
And final question, if I might. I think one of the concerns all legislators had was how do we help our constituents? And I think we had certainly a recognition that the pandemic was something none of us ever had to deal with in almost every dimension of our lives, and unemployment was certainly one of them too. And I heard Senator Alley ask about staffing, and I guess I'm pleased to know that your agency is in agreement with the governors where you wanted more people. I think as a legislator, I want to make sure you have enough people so that we can take care of our constituents who are in a difficult situation. And I couldn't be happier that our unemployment rate is down. I just wish we had more people taking the jobs that were open. And I don't think you can do anything about that. But I want to make sure that in your budget that we're giving the department adequate support in terms of the staffing, particularly the staffing that you need. And I heard you say that, so I'm just asking for final reassurance on that.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. And like I said, I'd say where we landed with the governor's office is what the agency needs to be successful. The other item I'd note is, I've personally not been in this role the entire course of the pandemic, but many folks at the agency have and stuck through 2 years of just absolute misery and challenges. I know you all have worked with Julie and her team over the course of the past few years to get assistance to those. We have many frontline unemployment insurance staff that are answering the phones every day and have been doing it for 2 years that, in my view, are kind of the unsung heroes of trying to fight a broken system to help their fellow Kansans. Part of the request from that we agreed on with the governor's recommendation is a pay increase for those frontline individuals because we believe that they are the individuals who have had the most impact, who have talked to folks on the front line and have done everything they can in their power to help them. But to address the kind of the final reassurance, Senator, yes, I believe the recommendation we landed on with the governor's office is what this agency needs to be successful.
And Mr. Chairman, I want certainly your employees to know and especially Julie, who got lots of phone calls from me, to know how much I appreciate the work they did to help people. I know a lot of my constituents were having difficulty, were very frustrated, but I know that frustration was not just on the people that were trying to get their benefits, but on the people that were trying to figure out how to make that antiquated system work and all the glitches that we had. And again, you reminded me that the federal government didn't make this very easy with the number of programs that kept rolling out. So please extend mine and I think probably the legislature's appreciation for the help. We were frustrated too, but I certainly feel better about it now, and I thank you and the staff for what they did to help get us through this. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Committee, we got another couple issues to address, and we want to deliberate this budget as well. So with that, sir, appreciate you being here. Your answers are extremely helpful. And again, I want to thank you as well for your work. Julie, you and your team, you know, we've been working together for quite a while. So I want to express a real sincere appreciation to you as well. You're thrown into a very chaotic environment, and I know personally that can be challenging. So again, thank you all. Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman.
Okay, committee, let's take, yes. Good morning.
Oh, thank you. Sorry. So that does create a problem for us. The Division of Budget is aware, and the two items are the salaries for the UI committee, the Modernization Committee, that we've already spent, and that's roughly $29,000, and then the audit, which is capped at $250,000. So I don't know what can be done at this point. The Division of Budget is looking into the issue, but I have not heard a resolution. So I just wanted to bring it to your attention. If there's something that can be done to help us out, that would be awesome.
Thank you. We'll discuss that here briefly and try to make sure we can work through that issue. Okay, thank you very much. Committee, on that note, I think it'd be my opinion that we go ahead and pass this out and work that issue in full committee. Once we get more information and a commentary on the budget itself, that's an issue that we should address. So with that, go ahead.
I'm sorry, before you make your motion, I just wanted to bring one more thing to your attention. And again, I'm sorry for interrupting. So as you noted, the 9.6 million is now federally funded, but that requires a motion to actually add that fund to the appropriations bill because it happened after the appropriations bill was written. So I just wanted to point out, in order for the agency to even spend that 9.6 million, it does require a motion to add that fund. So it's just something you might want to consider for your recommendations also. Thank you.
Make a motion to move the 9.6 million.
No, you just need to physically add the name of the fund. So just add language to add the American Rescue Plan Act fund for the Department of Labor. The fund literally needs to be listed in the appropriations bill. So you're not moving money, just creating the fund. You can do it here or you can do it in the full committee. It doesn't, whatever's your preference. Yes, you can do that as adjustment to your budget recommendation.
Committee, we have a motion for any adjustment. I would make that motion. Got a motion and a second to make that adjustment. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. Motion passes. Okay, that adjustment will be noted in our report. Senator Hawk.
Mr. Chairman, I thought I heard you also sort of hint at making a recommendation to approve the 22 and 23 budget and with the governor's recommendation, and I assume that includes their capital improvements also. I would second what I thought I heard you making a motion on prior to the adjustment.
do want a full motion on that.
I would appreciate a full motion.
Yeah, we'll move the Department of Labor FY '22 and '23 budget at the committee's recommendation, which includes the governor's recommendation plus the 9.6.
Yeah, it's
Million.
just the creation of the fund. That's all you're doing,
Fantastic.
creating the fund.
What Victoria said.
We've got a motion and a second to pass out the Department of Labor's budget along with those amendments. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? Nay? No. Okay, it's passed out. Senator Hawk.
Mr. Chairman. Maybe Victoria can help us on that. We heard about needing to make, since that the ARPA funds were not eligible for a couple of those items, $29,000 on salaries for the UI committee and the $250,000 audit. Could we add that as an adjustment to be considered when the budget's presented as a separate item, so we don't forget that? Yeah. Do we need a motion to put that in there?
You can make yes, a motion would be good, just to note, you would like Ways and Means to review the possibility of adding funds for the $250,000 and the $29,000 that is not covered. Sure, yeah, you don't have to actually add it. Yeah. Sure, yeah.
You want a motion on that? Okay. I'm good, it's there. Perfect.
Okay. Come forward. Identify yourself.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. Amber Schultz, I am the Secretary of Labor. I just want to make a point of clarification. The $29,000 in salary is what we have currently paid. So going forward, I just wanted to bring that to your attention. Thank you.
Question, do we need to put more money in there than the $29,000 when we eventually deal with it?
Yes, and we can give you some salary projections. It all depends on the cadence of the meetings.
Great, thank you.
Okay, committee, that takes care of our budget meeting on the Department of Labor. That's completed. I want to go back to the Department of Administration. If you recall, the presentations by that department over the last couple days, anybody have anything that they are concerned about on that budget? If not, I would like to entertain a motion to pass that budget out as well. Senator Hawk?
Mr. Chairman, so moved to pass out 22-23 budget.
Of the Department of Administration.
Department of Administration.
We've got a motion and a second by Senator Clays to pass the budget out on Department of Administration for 22-23. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. Motion passes. Budget's pushed out. Okay, committee, that concludes our work, except for Senator Hawk's one last question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I love the way we do these committees, and I can't remember what we've done, but did we pass out the OITS budget yesterday? Do we need to do that? We did. They did that already. We did that already. Good. Thank you. And I just.
We're supposed to be scheduled for a meeting next Tuesday morning. I'm just trying to clear up.
And we won't need to have that meeting. And the only thing I wanted to say about that, and I think Senator Alley said it too, and I just want to keep saying it, I am so pleased that we are on top of our IT system.
Yeah.
And that is greatly appreciated, I think.